August 7th, 1942, 0600 hours. Transport USS George F. Elliott, approaching Guadalcanal.
The static hissed through my headset like a living thing as I adjusted the frequency dial one more time. 47 pounds of radio equipment pressed against my back. The SCR-300, the most advanced battlefield communication system the world had ever seen. Around me, 2,000 Marines packed the transport's hold, and I was the only one carrying the technology that would determine whether we lived or died on that beach. My name is Radio Operator Second Class Thomas Mitchell, United States Marine Corps, 1st Marine Division. I'd trained for 8 months on this equipment at Camp Elliott, learning every frequency, every tube, every wire that connected our fighting force to the artillery and air support that would keep us alive. The instructors had been clear. Lose the radio, lose the battle. Keep it working, give your brothers a fighting chance. Through the porthole, I could see Guadalcanal rising from the Pacific like a dark promise. Intelligence said the Japanese had 8,000 troops defending that island, dug into positions they'd spent months fortifying. They had artillery, they had supplies, they had the advantage of terrain. What they didn't have was what I was carrying on my back. They didn't have a communication system that worked. The pre-landing bombardment started at 0613 hours, and I felt each 16-inch shell departure as a physical shock through the ship's deck. The shoreline disappeared behind columns of fire and smoke. Battleships North Carolina and Washington were rewriting the landscape, turning Japanese positions into craters. But bombardment could only do so much. Once we hit that beach, once the naval guns fell silent, everything would depend on coordination. Everything would depend on radios like mine. Mitchell, Sergeant Barnes gripped my shoulder, his face carved from stone, but his eyes showing something else. The knowledge that green troops like me were about to face something we'd only imagined in training. You stay in sight of Lieutenant Morrison at all times. That radio doesn't transmit. We're fighting blind. You understand what that means? I understood. Without communication, each unit became isolated, unable to call for fire support, unable to warn adjacent units of enemy movements, unable to coordinate the complex dance of modern warfare. The Japanese had learned this lesson the hard way in China, where their radio equipment constantly failed, forcing them to rely on runners and field telephones that American artillery cut to pieces. We weren't going to make that mistake. At 0741 hours, the landing craft ramp dropped with a metallic shriek that cut through the morning air. Beyond it lay beach red, 200 yards of white sand that separated the known world from whatever hell waited in that jungle. Lieutenant Morrison went first, and I followed, stepping into water that came up to my chest. The radio rode high on my shoulders, its waterproof casing supposedly proof against submersion. Supposedly being the word that kept running through my mind as waves crashed against my chest. One wrong step, one stumble into deeper water, and $20,000 of cutting-edge technology would become 47 pounds of useless metal and wire. I kept my footing, pushed through the surf, hit the beach, expecting the storm of Japanese fire that intelligence had promised. Instead, I found something more unsettling. Silence. Thick, humid silence, broken only by the sound of thousands of Marines spreading across the sand, like a green tide. The enemy had withdrawn into the jungle. "Set up the radio," Morrison ordered, his face tight with the same confusion we all felt. "Get me division headquarters." My hands moved through the setup routine I'd practiced 1,000 times, unfolded the whip antenna, checked the battery connections, powered up the transmitter. The tubes needed 30 seconds to warm up, 30 seconds that felt like 30 years while we stood exposed on that beach. The static cleared at 0756 hours, and I heard the most beautiful sound in the world. "Red Beach, this is Division. Reading you 5 by 5. Report status." "Division, this is Morrison, 1st Battalion. Beach secured. No resistance. Advancing inland toward Objective Baker." He paused, looking at the jungle that pressed against the sand like a living wall. "Requesting reconnaissance before full advance." "Negative, Red Beach. All units push inland immediately. Enemy withdrawing to prepared positions. Do not allow them time to regroup." That's when the reality hit me. The Japanese hadn't abandoned Guadalcanal. They'd pulled back into the jungle, into terrain they knew intimately, into positions they'd prepared for exactly this scenario. They were waiting for us to spread out, to lose cohesion, to become separated in that green hell. They were waiting for our communications to fail. The 1st Marines pushed inland at 8:15 hours. I stayed 5 yards behind Lieutenant Morrison, the radio antenna marking our position like a flag. The jungle swallowed us within minutes. Visibility dropped to 20 feet. Sounds became muffled, distorted by the dense vegetation. Other units disappeared from sight, and suddenly the only proof they existed came through my headset, voices crackling through the static, reporting positions, requesting support, coordinating the advance. At 8:47 hours, the first Japanese resistance materialized from the jungle like ghosts. Machine gun fire tore through the foliage from positions we couldn't see. Morrison dropped flat, and I hit the ground beside him, feeling the radio's weight threaten to crush my spine. Bullets snapped overhead with that distinctive crack that meant they were passing close enough to kill. "Get me fire support," Morrison shouted over the noise. "Grid coordinates 379248. I keyed the transmit button. Fear did that. Made your fingers clumsy. Made your voice crack when you needed it most. "Fire direction, this is Red Beach Actual. Enemy contact, grid 379248, requesting immediate artillery support." The response came within seconds, calm and professional despite the chaos. "Red Beach, this is fire direction. Shot out in 45 seconds. Danger close. Take cover." 45 seconds felt like forever. Japanese fire intensified, tracers drawing luminescent lines through the jungle gloom. I pressed myself into the earth, feeling roots dig into my chest, tasting dirt and fear. Somewhere close, a Marine screamed. Another shouted for a corpsman. Then the world exploded. Naval artillery strikes hit with devastating precision. 127mm shells detonating in the Japanese positions, 300 yards ahead. The jungle erupted in fountains of dirt and shattered trees. The concussion wave rolled over us like a physical force, and when my ears stopped ringing, the enemy fire had ceased. "Red Beach, fire direction, report effect." Morrison keyed his handset, voice steadier now. "Fire direction, target destroyed, advancing." We pushed forward, and I realized something that would define the entire Guadalcanal campaign. The Japanese had never faced an enemy with this level of fire support coordination. Their radio equipment, built in the 1930s using German designs, couldn't match the range, clarity, or reliability of American FM systems. When Japanese units called for artillery support, their requests took minutes or hours to process through wire communications. Ours took seconds. The mathematics of modern warfare had shifted, and the Japanese didn't know it yet. By 1200 hours, 1st Marines had reached the edge of the airfield, the strategic prize that would turn Guadalcanal into a backwater island to the pivot point of the Pacific War. The
airstrip stretched before us, nearly complete, built by Japanese engineers and Korean laborers. Intelligence had been right about one thing. Whoever controlled this airfield would control the surrounding seas and skies. Mitchell, get me division. Morrison was studying the airfield through binoculars, watching for movement in the tree line across the runway. Report airfield secured. I made the call, but something in the static pattern made my stomach tighten. The signal was degrading, becoming intermittent. I checked the equipment. Batteries at 70%, antenna intact, all connections solid. The problem wasn't mechanical.
The problem was the jungle itself, the dense vegetation, the humidity, the island's volcanic terrain, all of it absorbed in scattered radio waves in ways our stateside testing had never accounted for. My beautiful cutting-edge radio, with its theoretical 5-mile range, was struggling to transmit 2 miles through this green hell. Division, this is Red Beach Actual, I transmitted, speaking slowly and clearly to punch through the interference. Airfield secured, no enemy contact, requesting orders. Static. Then fragments of a response. Red, hold, reinforce, defense. Division, say again, you're breaking up. More static, then nothing. The connection had dropped completely. Morrison looked at me, and I saw the fear beneath his command facade. We'd secured the airfield, but we were also exposed, far ahead of supporting units, potentially cut off from the fire support that had saved us that morning. Without radio communications, we were alone on an island with 8,000 enemy troops. "Can you fix it?" he asked quietly. I was already tearing into the radio casing, checking connections, testing voltage levels. Everything showed normal. The equipment was fine. The problem was physics. Radio waves bouncing off the jungle canopy, scattering through humidity, losing strength with every yard they traveled through this impossible terrain. "Sir, the radio works, but we need higher ground, clear line of sight to the beach." I pointed to a ridge rising behind the airfield, maybe 200 feet of elevation. From up there, we might punch through. Morrison studied the ridge, calculating risks. Every minute we delayed gave the Japanese time to regroup, but without communications, we were fighting blind. "Can you fix it?" he asked quietly. I was already tearing into the radio casing, checking connections, testing voltage levels. Everything showed normal. The equipment was fine. The problem was physics. Radio waves bouncing off the jungle canopy, scattering through humidity, losing strength with every yard they traveled through this impossible terrain. I climbed that ridge with 3 other Marines, the radio bouncing against my spine with every step. The jungle was different away from the beach, older, darker, filled with sounds that didn't belong to birds or wind. Davis kept his rifle ready, watching for enemy scouts that intelligence said filled these hills. We reached the ridge top at 12:47 hours. I set up the antenna, oriented it toward the beach, powered up the transmitter, and prayed. "Division, this is Red Beach Actual, radio check, over." The response came through crystal clear. "Red Beach, reading you 5 by 5. Where the hell have you been?" I almost laughed with relief. From this elevation, with clear line of sight over the jungle canopy, the radio performed exactly as designed. I could reach every unit on the island, could coordinate fire support from ships miles offshore, could call in airstrikes from carriers beyond the horizon. I had turned a ridge in the jungle into the nerve center of the entire American operation. Division, advise Lieutenant Morrison that Red Beach has established communication post on high ground, can relay all traffic for forward units. Understood, Red Beach, stand by for traffic. What followed changed everything. Over the next 6 hours, I became the voice connecting 20 different Marine units spread across Guadalcanal. When 2nd Battalion hit Japanese resistance near the Lunga River, I coordinated naval gunfire that broke the enemy position. When 3rd Battalion requested air support against enemy artillery, I relayed their coordinates to carrier-based dive bombers. When Colonel Hunt needed to coordinate a 3-battalion assault on Japanese headquarters, I became the switchboard that made it possible. The Japanese commanders were learning a harsh lesson. They were fighting an enemy that could see the entire battlefield at once, that could concentrate overwhelming force at any point within minutes, that could adapt and respond faster than human runners could carry messages. They were fighting an enemy connected by invisible threads of electromagnetic radiation, coordinated by technology they couldn't match. At 1845 hours, as the tropical sun began its rapid descent toward the horizon, I intercepted a Japanese radio transmission. Their equipment operated on different frequencies, used amplitude modulation that was easy to hear, but impossible to decode without knowing their cipher. Still, I could hear the tone, urgent, desperate, requesting reinforcements that wouldn't come. They were already losing, and the battle had barely begun. Corporal Davis tapped my shoulder, pointing into the jungle below. Japanese troops were moving, visible as shadows against darker shadows, maybe 200 men, infiltrating toward the airfield where Morrison's battalion had dug in for the night. Division, this is Red Beach Radio Post. Enemy movement, grid 417293, approximately 200 troops moving northwest toward airfield. Request immediate fire mission. Red Beach, fire direction, confirm grid 417293. Confirmed, enemy in the open, moving through sparse jungle, high explosive, time on target. Shot out in 90 seconds, danger close to friendly positions. I relayed the warning to Morrison, told him to get everyone into foxholes and stay down. Watched the seconds tick by on my watch. At exactly 90 seconds, the jungle below erupted. Naval artillery had gotten so good at this, so precise, that they could drop shells within 300 yards of friendly positions without risk. The Japanese column disappeared in a rolling barrage of high explosive that walked through their formation like the hand of God. When the smoke cleared, maybe 20 men were still moving, and they were running back the way they'd come. Fire direction, this is Red Beach. Target destroyed. Estimate 180 enemy casualties. Nice shooting. Red Beach, fire direction, all in a day's work. That night, sitting on my ridge with the radio humming beside me, I understood what we'd accomplished. The Japanese had superior numbers, superior position, months of preparation. But we had something they couldn't counter. The ability to fight as a single coordinated organism, with every unit aware of every other unit's position, with fire support responding in seconds instead of hours. We had turned communication into a weapon, and it was proving more deadly than any rifle or artillery piece.
The battle for Guadalcanal would last 6 more months. The Japanese would land reinforcements, would launch counterattacks, would fight with a ferocity that would earn our respect even as we killed them. But they never solved the radio problem. Their equipment continued failing in the jungle humidity. Their batteries ran out, their tubes burned out under the tropical heat, and their commanders made decisions based on information that was hours or days old. Meanwhile, every Marine unit on Guadalcanal carried radios that worked. Company commanders talked to battalion commanders, who talked to regimental commanders, who talked to division headquarters.
Artillery observers called fire missions that arrived in under 2 minutes. Air liaison officers coordinated bomber strikes with frontline troops. Medical units received casualty reports in real time and positioned aid stations accordingly. We had turned warfare into a science, and the Japanese were still fighting an art. On February 9, 1943, the last Japanese troops evacuated Guadalcanal. They left behind 11,000 dead, another 1,000 who had succumbed to disease and starvation, and the strategic momentum of the entire Pacific War. The Americans lost 1,600 Marines, but we'd proven something that would define every battle from that point forward. Superior communications determined victory more surely than superior courage. I carried that radio for 8 more months, through Tarawa, through the Marshall Islands, through campaigns that would have been impossible without the coordination it provided. The SCR-300 became as important to Marine operations as rifles or ammunition. Units that lost radio contact were considered combat ineffective. Radio operators became priority targets for Japanese snipers who finally understood what those antennae represented. By 1944, the technology had evolved. The SCR-300 gave way to lighter, more powerful systems. Frequency-hopping spread spectrum technology made our communications impossible to jam. By 1945, every squad had portable radios, and battlefield coordination reached levels that would have seemed like science fiction just 3 years earlier. But it all started on Guadalcanal, on a ridge overlooking an airfield, with a nervous 22-year-old radio operator who learned that sometimes the most important weapon isn't the one that kills the enemy, it's the one that connects your brothers in a network too fast and too powerful for any opponent to counter. The Japanese commanders had laughed at American radio equipment, dismissed it as overcomplicated, too heavy, too dependent on delicate electronics that would never survive combat conditions. They learned their mistake through 6 months of systematic defeat, watching their defensive positions destroyed by artillery fire that arrived with supernatural speed, watching their counterattacks broken by American units that somehow always knew where they were coming from. They learned that modern warfare wasn't about individual warriors or tactical brilliance. It was about systems, about networks, about the side that could process information faster and coordinate responses more effectively. They learned that sometimes a radio operator on a ridge mattered more than a battalion of infantry in the jungle below. I made it home in 1945, the radio long since replaced by newer models, but I never forgot that ridge on Guadalcanal, those first desperate hours when everything depended on keeping 47 pounds of electronics working in conditions that should have destroyed it. I never forgot the voices in my headset, frightened, determined, professional, all connected by invisible threads of electromagnetic radiation that I controlled with a frequency dial and a transmit button. I never forgot that warfare had changed forever, and I'd been there to see it happen.